Hello, my name is Cody Price and I just want to welcome everyone. It is now 1 o'clock, so we'll begin our presentation shortly. Today on May 6th, we'll have our presentation on using GIS to improve planning decisions, Part 1, Identifying Factors that Influence Rural Land Parcelization, given by Dan McFarlane. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box and we'll be able to answer those at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session. Here's a list of our participating chapters, divisions, and universities, and I just want to send a personal thank you out to the Wisconsin chapter for sponsoring today's webinar. Here's a list of our upcoming webcasts. Our next one will be on May 13th, Secrets to Improve Consultant-Client Relations. And then on May 19th, we'll have new ideas for bike-friendly communities. You'll be able to find a complete listing for 2011 and register for your webcast of choice by visiting www.utah-apa.org/webcast. To log your STEAM credits for attending today's session, please go to www.planning.org/cm. Select activities by date, and then on underneath Friday, May 6th, you'll see Using GIS to Improve Planning Decisions, Part 1. And this is up already, so after the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be able to find this on the website to log credit. And then we are recording today's session, so afterwards you'll be able to find a PDF and video recording of today's webinar at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive, and this should be up by the following Monday. At this time, I would now like to hand it over to Linda Stoll, who will be introducing our speaker for today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Linda Stoll. I am an outreach specialist with the Center for Land Use Education at UW-Stevens Point. Today, my colleague Dan McFarlane will be speaking. He is a research specialist with the center, and our center was formed to assist the communities in Wisconsin to meet a state-required mandate for comprehensive planning. We have since then branched out into a number of different planning arenas, and Dan is going to speak on one of those today. So with that, go ahead, Dan.
Good afternoon, everyone, and morning for those who are on the West Coast. My name is Dan McFarlane, and welcome to today's presentation. I'm going to talk about today some of the factors influencing rural parcelization. Over the years, or a few years ago, the Center for Land Use had done some research on rural parcelization, and it's been really well received, and a lot of folks have been interested in it, so that's why they asked me to present today. And I believe the title said Part 1. There will be no Part 2, so this will be the GIS component for rural parcelization. So there will be no Part 2, I guess, is the theme there. So today I'm going to talk about some of the trends. Actually, I'll show you my overview here. What is the meaning of parcelization? What are we talking about when we talk about parcelization, and why should we care about it? With that, we'll also show, I'll hopefully use an innovative approach here to show you what I'm talking about, to show you some trends. I plan to use Google Earth here today to sort of virtually show you some parcelization trends that we're experiencing in rural America, and then briefly go over some history and some of the causes, and then I'll wrap it up with some of the existing research trends out there, what people are doing to measure parcelization or to assess parcelization, and then I'll wrap it up with some of the case studies that we've done here with the Center for Land Use Education, what I've been involved with. So we're going to go ahead and get going here. So land parcels sort of constitute sort of a fundamentally but largely invisible dimension of the landscape. You can't really see them, but they're there. And there's always been a confusion here recently between parcelization and fragmentation. So what I mean with parcelization is really sort of the division of parcels into progressively smaller parcels and then their subsequent sale on the market. It's through parcelization that the land itself and the resources are consumed and packaged for retail consumption as real estate. This phenomenon isn't new. It's been going on for a long time, but it can have profound effects on the economics of a rural area and the ecology as well, and we'll get into that. So when we're talking about parcelization, we're talking about the division of land, usually larger parcels into smaller, and then their sale on the market. On the other hand, fragmentation is the breaking up of large contiguous blocks of land. As this picture shows here, you can see that the homes have perforated the forest landscape there. The definitions of fragmentation vary, but landscape ecologists are pointing out that the rampant parcelization of undeveloped rural lands, particularly in forested areas, inevitably leads to habitat fragmentation. And now I'm going to test this for everybody here and go to Google Earth and show you what I mean by some of parcelization. Usually parcelization occurs before fragmentation. For example, like in a highly parcelized forest, it's not necessarily ecologically fragmented. However, having many different landowners does create sort of a fragmented mosaic of management. So this is northern Wisconsin, a heavily forested region that you're seeing on your screen. This is Google Earth, by the way. I recommend using it for those who like to go on virtual vacations. This landscape here is heavily forested, and when you look at it without the parcel lines here, one would think that there's a lot of forest land here. It's probably a lot of timber productivity, a lot of land resources here. When you overlay the current parcel landscape, it tells a different story. One would argue that this is highly parcelized, and so this can have extreme and dramatic impacts on the resources there in terms of forestry and others. Another example here is a platted subdivision without any development yet. And so again, one would argue that this is a highly parcelized forest, but it's not necessarily fragmented. And so what we're trying to say here and show here is that you don't necessarily have fragmentation when you have parcelization. And we're finding that a lot of rural areas aren't really fragmenting or necessarily growing in terms of population, but they are growing in terms of the number of parcels that are being carved out. This is an example taken from a publication in, I believe, 2005, and what you're seeing a lot is the desire of people to live in rural areas. In order to do that, they need to purchase property or to have a lot subdivided. This is an example taken from a newspaper clipping of, I believe it's an industrial forest land owner in northern Wisconsin several years ago, looking to divest some of its premier land into large 40-acre parcels and then selling them on the market. And so that's a major concern, especially among the forest industry, is the loss of a lot of the productive industrial forest land in this way. I want to point this out. Just as the division of tax parcels precedes the division of ownership parcels, the division of ownership parcels precedes changes in land use or landscape fragmentation. In this example here that you see on the screen, that should pop up, there it is. The red boundary there highlights an ownership tract. So one owner owns that. I believe it's about probably 20 acres there. And the yellow lines are highlighting tax parcels. And so as the statement there says, precedes the division of ownership parcels. A lot of research has been done on ownership parcels, looking at plat books and whatnot, but that necessarily doesn't show the true picture of what the intention of the landowner has here. And you can see that here the landowner had divided out a road right away and many smaller parcels in a very rural area and heavily forested. And then the subsequent sale on the market. In fact, there's only one lot in this subdivision that's developed, but you can see that fragmentation has already occurred. Driveways, the road, and other home sites have been created. And I also want to fly to that one with you, and I'll wait until Google Earth displays for you. This subdivision was platted a few years ago near north central Wisconsin. I see Google Earth is a little slow, so we'll wait until it catches up for you. Here's the subdivision as it looks right now. Mostly undeveloped. There's one home in the center on the right there. And what we find interesting is a colleague of mine had driven past there a few years ago and took a picture of the entrance to that. And the picture should pop up here for you. We just find it kind of ironic that this is the name of the subdivision. They called it Forest Edge. And as while my colleague was taking the picture, a small fox was running through. We find it ironic because the subdivision is there basically creating more forest edge and more forest fragmentation, even though it sits mostly empty. So what's driving parcelization? We're finding nationwide that development pressure in rural areas continues to grow. Historically, if you think way back, rural populations outnumbered urban areas. In fact, most people lived in rural areas up until the early 20th century due to mechanization, the industrial age. There was a less need for people to be subsiding, I guess, in rural areas, and there was a large sort of exodus of rural populations, and they moved to the cities. However, since about the 1950s, that has changed, and you see a large push of people leaving the cities and moving back to the rural areas towards their, I guess, their agrarian paths. And the graph here on the left shows that, part of that is, people are moving back to rural areas, not to back to their agrarian paths and doing farming and forestry and other extractive resources. They're moving back to rural areas in more of a consumptive manner and sort of wanting to live there to enjoy the open space themselves. And you're seeing farmland loss in some of our most productive states, but you're also seeing people wanting more elbow room. If you look at the graph at the right, the U.S. population over the last is projected to increase about 24%, but the amount of land development in terms of how much land per person they consume is expected to increase a lot more. And so I guess the alarming trend with that is that these rural areas provide the food, the fiber, the minerals for an even bigger population, but we're carving out the land and trying to get more goods from it off a smaller land base, which is causing concern. We're also seeing some nationwide trends in terms of folks looking at some survey data, forest inventory survey data, and we are noticing that forest parcel sizes are decreasing. In fact, since about 1953, you're finding private forest land parcels have decreased from about 44 acres per private landowner, non-industrial private landowner, to about 14 acres. And that's causing concern because the smaller the parcel size, the less likely you are to manage for forestry. And then if you look at the size distribution of those, 1 acre to 9 acre size class is where the majority of the landowners are. However, if you look at the amount of land owned, it's the large landowners. There's very few of them that own 10,000 or more acres, but they do own a majority of the forest land. A lot of that's the industrial forest land owners there. But this is an alarming trend, especially for resource managers trying to, and a lot of the paper mills and pulp mills as well, trying to find enough material for their mills. This next slide, once it pops up here, is some more summary statistics, I guess, in some of the forest land owners. Most of the parcelization literature that you find is forestry based. There really isn't much else out there in terms of other types of land cover, land use. mostly forest-based. And so this is what I'm pulling from. And so right now we're seeing about 94% of the forest land owners own less than 100 acres. Another trend, an alarming trend, is that the aging forest land owner, most of them are over 65 years and older, and they account for about 90 million acres. And also the 10 to 50 acre range, that number has doubled over the last 2 decades, and so you're finding a lot of sort of small to medium sized forest land parcels. And every year about 150,000 new forest land owners are purchasing forest property, and so you're seeing a large number of new people with very different, I guess, backgrounds than the traditional forest land owner. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of parcelization. I guess these can sort of be broken down into socioeconomic consequences and ecological consequences. So first here, with smaller parcel sizes, it creates a diminished economy of scale, especially with forestry, and the same goes for farming as well. It's much more difficult for forest managers and timber companies to manage wood supply on a smaller parcel. Parcelized forests are also difficult to manage, resulting in lower profitability. New residents disapprove of land management practices. They come from diverse backgrounds and diverse geographic areas. And with that, I want to show another Google Earth view here. What I mean by diverse landowners. What I had done with this, what you'll see here, is I took some parcels from northern Wisconsin, which is seeing a lot of amenity-led parcelization and development, and we're getting, it's experiencing a lot of landowners from out of the region. And so if you look at this, they call it a spider diagram, so I use GIS here to map the basically home address of what's listed on the parcel data. And zooming out, you can see that a majority of the landowners come as far away as the East Coast. Most of them are from, a majority of them are from Duluth area, Minneapolis, St. Paul. So a lot of urban residents own property up here. And so when you're trying to plan with such a diverse stakeholder group, it becomes very challenging. Part of it is these people are seasonal. They're not there very often. One of the other things we're finding is a lot of these are waterfront property owners, and so I work with folks here at the university that are trying to put lake management plans together with a lot of these parcelized lakes, and trying to get everybody together with consistent views on how should we manage and protect our lakes becomes very challenging with a diverse. And so mapping this spider diagram really helps to show, what's happening in some of these amenity areas with natural features that are driving rural development. One of the other effects that we're seeing with that's been pointed out in the literature with parcelization is, especially in forested regions, is that a lot of pine plantations are being parceled off and sold to people who find them to be very attractive wilderness, secluded areas. However, foresters are viewing these as very fire-prone areas. And so if I show you another example of that, I hope nobody is getting turbulence here and sick watching me fly to these areas. I apologize. On my screen, it's very smooth. However, as I watch the audience view, I see that it's much choppier. But this next area I want to show you is the pine barrens of northwest Wisconsin. There's a lot of pine plantations, very sandy soils. What you're finding is a lot of the owners of the land, whether they're industrial forest land owners or private land owners, is they're clear cutting the pine plantations or logging them off or select cutting them and subdividing them into many rural lots like this, and then marketing them to urban folks that find them very attractive wilderness areas. But they're, the planning folks and the foresters are finding these are very susceptible to fire and damage there. We also find an increased need for public services when you have parcelization, especially low-density parcelization. This increases the need for public services. Ensuing tax increases reduces the profits from farming and row crop production, which I guess in turns accelerates the decline in the already startling number of farm producers out there, especially in Wisconsin. And what I'll show you there is another trend you're finding in some of the more agricultural regions in terms of parcelization is here in southern Wisconsin, which is very agriculturally productive. You're finding large lot development, and part of that has to do with the zoning ordinance allowing for large lots for rural development. But what that does, though, is it's creating these very low density developed areas. What you see here on your screen here are many 40-acre parcels that was once productive farmland that are now very large lawns with very long driveways. And so to service these, to provide emergency management vehicles to get back there, or electricity or school buses, becomes very expensive to service parcelization patterns like this. Very long driveways, some of these upwards to a half of a mile. And so those are, it's a fairly predictable fiscal impact when you've got this kind of low density development. We're also finding farmland fragmentation. In the literature, you will hardly find anything about farmland fragmentation. You hear a lot about forest land fragmentation, but the same concepts apply with farmland fragmentation. What I highlighted here were some homes in yellow, home lots here in a very agriculturally productive area. And you're noticing that these home lots are perforating the productive farmland. And what happens then is sort of the more edge you have around a farm field, edge between an ag use versus a non-ag use, such as residential development, you find increased conflicts between farmers and non-farmers, those residents complaining about the smell of manure, the noise, pesticide application. And so the more you fragment a farming landscape, the more likely it is that it's going to be converted probably anyway, just due to the lack of capacity for farming. And it does create a lot of tension that we're finding between the new residents and the farmers when it's a more fragmented landscape. Other socioeconomic consequences with parcelization is the loss of recreational open space. Residents often complain about lands that they used to be able to have access to are now sold and split, and the new residents want that for their own secluded, peaceful place, and so they'll put no trespassing signs up. As a result of that, you're finding increased pressure on our limited public lands, and you're finding a lot of recreational conflicts on those public lands because there's more pressure, especially between those that are trying to use it in a more peaceful, quiet manner, like the photo on the bottom right there, and those that are trying to do a little more loud, motorized recreational uses on our public lands. And so you're seeing some more social conflicts and loss of open space with continued parcelization. And you've seen this photo before. Another effect of parcelization is eventual forest fragmentation. Sort of there is a time lag there, just because parcelization doesn't necessarily mean fragmentation is going to happen, but it does increase the chances. And so by parcelizing a forested landscape, it increases the odds that roads will go in, building sites will go in, driveways, power lines, all creating less forest core area and fragmenting it. And a fragmented landscape increases or encourages the spread of invasive and exotic species. Roads provide sort of these utility corridors for them. It enhances the habitat for edge species and might reduce the number of more desired species that need large core areas. May also see decreased plant animal diversity, sort of the negative consequences of forest or landscape fragmentation in general. We're also seeing forest health impacts with parcelization. At least in the upper Midwest, researchers have found that the succession of the forest base, especially in commercially valued species such as aspen and oak and pine, are reverting to more or less desired species on parcelized landscapes, partly because the new owners are less likely to manage for higher desired species. And the consequence of that is a lot of the mills, paper and pulp mills, rely on these higher valued species, and when they're not available, at least in close proximity, they have to rely on outside sources. And we're seeing some of the mills here in central and northern Wisconsin laying people off or even closing right now because of the lack of demand, and part of that is the high transportation costs of bringing in new materials. And also areas with a lot of natural amenities like lakes. Lakes are such a strong driver of parcelization, is that we're seeing second and third tier and beyond development along those lakes. And so with that, you're seeing degradation of a lot of these sensitive resources. Wetlands and lakes with increased parcelization and development increases runoff, which eventually degrades water quality and can threaten aquatic ecosystems. And I want to show an example of that as well. And I apologize for using mostly Wisconsin examples, but that's where I'm mostly familiar with, and that's where most of my data that I have to show you comes from. So now we're going to go back up to northern Wisconsin, where we have an abundance of freshwater inland lakes and a lot of parcelization and development. And this example here you can see that the amount and dense parcelization. Now granted, keep in mind this area is very remote, it's very rural, but looking at the parcel landscape, you can see that most of these lakes are heavily parcelized, adding to increased runoff, and a lot of these lakes do have issues with runoff and water quality. The other example here I wanted to show you was the second and third tier development. Is that once the waterfront is divided, lakes are still such a strong driver for parcelization, is that you are seeing just being relatively close to a lake is highly valued. In this example right here, and you can see that roads and parcels are being carved out second and third tier and beyond from some of these lakes. So next I want to talk about some of the drivers of parcelization. I kind of alluded to those a little bit, such as some of the natural amenities. But the drivers of parcelization that you'll find in the literature, they talk about basically two types of drivers. There's the demand side of parcelization and then the supply of parcels. And on the demand side, you'll find that, not surprisingly, urbanization or population growth is one of the biggest drivers of parcelization. As there's more people, we need more land, more space to house them. They need more land to live. And so that is one of the largest drivers of that. And I want to show you an example of that, of suburbanization, that I think is really interesting to show. This is an example of parcelization, really subdivision development in southwest United States, just north of Albuquerque. And it may take you a little bit to fly there with the Google Earth, much quicker than a normal flight. And I'll wait for it to catch up. So what you're looking at right now is an elevated view of just a subdivision north of Albuquerque. And as I zoom in here, you'll notice some patterns showing up on the landscape. Those are actually roads that have been scraped in. And as I get in closer, you're going to see parcels appear. And so a growing population requires more land needed for people to live. And I hope the parcels show up for you. There we go. Those white lines you see there are actual lots that have been subdivided. This is I forget how many hundreds of square miles of lots that have been created, but what I'm going to do is pan here and show you a large subdivision that was platted, I believe, in the 1970s due to urbanization and growing population. It was a premature subdivision, and you'll notice that this thing goes on for miles with some very scattered homes that are popped up in here. Roads, cul-de-sacs are in here. It's quite amazing when I saw this amount of parcelization. Now, the problem with this is that the demand quite wasn't there for it at the time. And the challenge with that as a planner is that over time, the needs, the desires, the policies change. And so, yeah, we're still moving here. A lot of these lots will probably become non-conforming, but a lot of them have been sold to distant buyers, and they look at it as a retirement property. When they retire, they might want to come here, and you know, they might find that it's no longer buildable because of some of the ordinances that are in place. And so I just thought I wanted to show this example of what we mean by a growing population, even though the population isn't quite large enough to fill this subdivision. The next on the demand side is values and motivations. Today, people want open space. They want elbow room. There's a strong desire for people to own a second home or a seasonal home. That's sort of been ingrained in us. And the recreational land, especially hunting, fishing, camping, is a growing activity among people. And so owning land for an outdoor lifestyle is appealing, and they want that. And part of it is they have the means to do that. People are wealthier now than they have been in the past. And so a lot of these rural areas with natural amenities are a premier playground for this kind of activity. And you find rules and regulations and are historically have been weaker in rural areas, and so the supply for parcels has been relatively easy to get. People relish in the ease of rural property, I guess. And then the third thing here is natural capital. What I mean by natural capital, I'm talking about the amenities themselves. Lakes are a very strong driver. If you look at the bottom picture there, they're such a strong driver that people are willing to create lots like that just to be on the waterfront and to have access to that. We're finding, though, that once people can't afford lakefront property or it already becomes totally developed, some of the next best places are where people are looking to own property, and that's our forest land. Like on the right there, you're seeing subdivisions being carved out into some of our productive forest lands, but also other areas, and I want to show you some examples of that as well, again using Google Earth. And I'm going to fly to another area in Wisconsin that we're finding, we're teasing out with some of our research that are becoming attractive amenities for folks. And so what you see here is in south central Wisconsin, and I hope it shows up for you. There we go. I'm going to try to give you an oblique angle with this using the 3D capabilities of Google Earth. And you'll notice that favorable views, or places with long views, are becoming very attractive places and are being subdivided and parceled off and developed. This area here is one example. There's many other out there that we're finding that once Waterfront's divided and parcelized, we're finding that other areas such as places with favorable views. Other things you'll find in the literature is that some of the protected open spaces are becoming prime real estate, such as our national parks. And for that, I'm going to take you out to an example out west in Colorado, where people are finding that our national parks are becoming islands themselves because they're becoming completely developed almost nearly around or parcelized around. And so what you'll see here is just outside of Rocky Mountain National Park, once it catches up here, is you'll see that parcels will pop up, and you'll see how they're parcelizing this. If you can notice the parcel lines here along the ridges here in the mountains, is that our national parks are becoming islands themselves, and they're leading to sort of isolated patches of habitat for what they were designed for in the first place, and a lot of that was for protecting some of the species there, and we're finding that some of these parks may not be big enough for some of the species that they meant to protect. So here's some of the parcel lines showing up here. Is we're finding lots of subdivisions being carved out up and through the valleys and along the ridges here and sold to a lot of seasonal and recreational homeowners from far off urban areas. It's a growing trend. Yellowstone, Rocky Mountain National Park are becoming parcelized in terms of their perimeters. So now I'm going to talk about the supply side of parcelization. Again, most of the literature deals with forest land parcelization, and what I was able to dig up is on the supply side, you find that one of the first things is death. When a landowner dies, you find that oftentimes the owner will subdivide the property amongst the sons and daughters, and so over time you find an increased parcelized landscape. Now, one of the alarming trends that I talked about before is the growing age of forest land owners, and most of the, I forget what percentage it was, but a lot of the forest land owners are over the age of 65, and so relatively soon we're expecting to be a large turnover in ownership, and what that could mean is that we're going to see increased rate of parcelization due to that. The other thing is high taxes. You'll see that a lot of times, again, when a landowner dies and it's inherited by their kids, as the kids often will sell it or subdivide it to pay for high inheritance taxes. Sometimes that's a burden and they can't afford it. So in order to do that, they will often parcelize their properties for that. Taxes in terms of property taxes also is a burden. Especially in forest lands, where forest lands are, subjected to property taxes, and if the tax rate surpasses or approaches the appreciation value, or at least the forest value, the landowners find it more profitable to subdivide for other use. Even despite the ecological services that forest lands provide, federal and local taxes often do little to encourage, the economics of forest land ownership. You find more of that in farmland. One of the other big suppliers of parcels is land speculation. You find that developers, especially not so much now, but you did in the 1950s and 60s, land speculation was very big and very problematic. The U.S. It's a sharp rise in income following World War II. Population grew with the baby boomers, and that graph I showed earlier about land development increased. And so at the time, people were leaving or wanted to leave these congested cities, these dirty cities, for better schools, peaceful areas, and solitude. And so they were seeking rural communities. And what happened is developers took advantage of that a lot of times with fraud or pre-platted subdivisions. And so they were able to take advantage of very weak, lax subdivision and platting ordinances in many rural areas, and they rushed to sell as many lots as they possibly could by exploiting, the American dream of people owning a home out in the country. This happened particularly in Florida and the Southwest, similar to what you saw near Albuquerque there with that subdivision. But another example I wanted to show you of extreme land speculation and fraud actually occurred in Florida. And many of you are probably aware of this, but this is a subdivision that was platted in the 1950s in Florida, all at one time. I believe it's just outside of Orlando or something, but as you see it here, you'll again notice streets have been carved out onto the landscape, and I'll wait again for Google Earth to catch up to us here. There we go. So what you see here is a large subdivision, miles and miles. Now as I zoom in here, you're going to notice parcels pop up. And this was all platted at once, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of parcels. And these parcels were sold mostly by mail or through newspapers, and you can see here the parcels. And it goes on for miles. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but the landscape here is forested, but it's also very wet. This is part of the Everglades system. Canals were dug in to try to drain it, but given the amount of rain and some of the tropical storms that Florida gets, is proving challenging. Now, a lot of this land has been purchased back and is put into a state forest, I believe. But at the time, and what you're finding is, these developers sold these lots, by mail, sight unseen. Folks from New York, big cities, saw the glamorous ads in the newspaper and purchased them as retirement properties. And they would retire and come down here and find that their lot was actually underwater and could not be built on. And so it was very challenging. People were upset, and so there are methods and approaches and tools to alleviate this in terms of buying properties back. But when you're talking about thousands of landowners from across the globe owning properties, conglomerating these parcels back together is proving very challenging. The northern part of this subdivision, once it catches up here, you'll see is sporadically developed. Again, increasing the cost of services, maintaining these roads, busing these children, fragmenting the forest, and the habitat here. There we go. Now you can see some of the developed part of it. As a result of this, the fraud and some of this land speculation here and the headaches it causes, the federal government passed the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act back many years ago to sort of limit this type of fraud and selling of lots. I believe any subdivision over 100 lots has to be registered with the federal government. And so that sort of helps to alleviate that. Another trend you're also finding with I guess you could call it land speculation or the supply of parcels is that a lot of private landowners are supplying the market with parcels, and you're finding that farmers or other large landowners are seeking to sort of liquidate their small portion of wealth in land by selling or subdividing their property for retirement. And so you're seeing that not only do developers and whatnot are adding to the rural land market in terms of parcels, but you're finding that a lot of the private landowners are adding to that as well. Now, some folks would think that, rural parcelization isn't necessarily a bad thing. New people bring in new ideas, raises revenue, and creates jobs. But that always isn't the case, especially with subdivisions like this here, especially with these large pre-platted subdivisions, is that with the baby boomers looking to retire, some of these areas that have undergone parcelization and have a lot of vacant lots now have been undergoing huge population shifts. People are retiring there, and they don't really have the adequate services to support a population like that. And so you're finding a lot of negative impacts of some of these rampant parcelization areas. And then some of the other supplies is globalization. And what I mean by that is I'm talking about some of these industrial forest landowners. Historically, they've been mostly a local company in terms of where they own their property and where they did their business. However, over the past several years, as you're finding that a lot of these locally owned private industrial forest companies are being purchased by global companies, and their interest isn't necessarily timber or forest products. A lot of it, what you're finding is that they're divesting some of their property, some of their premier property, for higher, more immediate returns. And so the globalization of a lot of the forest industry is causing a lot of concern among planners in rural areas, especially those that have an adequate amount of forest land, industrial forest land. And the other thing is this technology and infrastructure. Technology, especially with the internet, folks are able to live at home, so they are not necessarily tied to a specific place of work. They can now live out in rural areas near where they want to be, and can work from home. And the other thing I want to show you and talk about is infrastructure. The interstate highway system has really led to a lot of rural parcelization, rural development. And you're going to see here, again, in southern Wisconsin, where an interchange along the interstate has influenced a pattern of parcelization here. There we go. Is you find that now folks can quickly get to work and live out in the country due to some of the transportation infrastructure improvements that we've made across the country. And so here's a pattern in a very heavily productive farmland area, but you're finding near this intersection here, folks can easily get on the interstate. And so you find a parcelization pattern here. Now this is likely to grow potentially in the future. So now I want to talk about some of the historic trends of parcelization. So like I said before, parcelization isn't new. It's been happening for a very, very long time. This snapshot here is actually from Europe, in France, I believe. And it shows land ownership that has gone on and land, I guess, parcelization for centuries. And you can see it's a very complex system there. Subdivision has gone on for centuries there, creating very complex system, very narrow lots. And so how we divide our land and sell our land goes back a long time. And part of that's due to the government's duty for enforcing private property rights. And so in order to resolve those, states need a clear method of determining where one person's land ends and another one's meets. And so over time, the states have become more demanding of how surveys and records are maintained, hopefully to mitigate some of those issues. This is the French long lot system here that you see. And this pattern you also see in the United States as well, because the French were some of the earliest settlers in the United States. This slide here, I took a screenshot of a county's data in Louisiana. This is an Oxbow Lake along the Mississippi. Again, this is the French long lot system pattern here. And this shows centuries, 200 years of land division in the United States. And this system, the decision to I guess, divide your property this way has implications far into the future. We're still dealing with complications like this. With this system, emphasis was placed on, on the water. You wanted access to the water so that, at the time, water was the main transportation routes. And so not having access to water wasn't a good thing. And so when someone would, split their land for offspring or to sell to another owner, they wanted to make sure that that land would sell. In order to do that, they had to make sure it had access to water. And so over time, you found lots of long, narrow lots. The The challenge with this, though, is that, floods, especially in this part of the country, rivers change course, and so you find that property boundaries are being bisected by, a new river channel, but also it's a very complex system with very thin properties. And so, again, the decision to have this kind of system has implications far into the future. So how we parcelize our landscape even today, we know is going to have implications far into the future as well, centuries from now. The other system I want to talk about is the meets and bounds system that you find in the eastern United States. This is a snapshot from eastern Tennessee, parcel boundaries here over top of an aerial photo. And again, this is several hundred years of land division in East Tennessee. And this type of pattern of subdividing land used natural features to subdivide property, like trees and rocks and ridge tops and streams. And by doing so, it's a very complex looking, very random pattern, but also research is finding that this pattern is less fragmenting because they're using not arbitrary boundaries, but they're using natural features for boundaries, especially along the middle diagonal there is a ridgetop. You can see there's a parcel boundaries go from the top right to the bottom left. That line there, that's a ridgetop there. So they use natural features for that. The advantage of this is, again, using natural features, maintain the natural landscape and reduce fragmentation. And many people find it in a more appealing look when they're driving through that rural area. It does have disadvantages, though. Using natural features, they're not permanent, and so thereby, verifying property boundaries can be challenging, especially if a tree is no longer available or there, or a river changes course and moves. Property boundary shifts, and you find a lot of conflicts with this type of system as well. So after, if we step back a little bit and talk about when the United States gained its independence, it acquired a whole bunch of land. And so in order to divest its land, which it was interested in doing, partly because it wanted to get rid of government-owned land and put it into private ownership, partly to raise tax revenue to increase the wealth of the country. It needed a system that was less complex as the previous two, the French lot system and the meets and bounds. That was very complex, and there were a lot of disputes. And so they developed a public land survey system. Again, a lot of you are probably aware of this. It's a rectangular system that divides the land into sections and townships and down to quarter sections. It's very square. But it was very effective in quickly being able to subdivide land. And so if you think about one of the all-time parcelization events, one could argue that the public land survey system was one of the largest and parcelization events in the U.S. history when it parcelized and divided and described a lot of its western lands from Ohio westward. But the PLSS has also played a formative role in land ownership patterns, given that the spatial layout of it is very square and allowed folks to sort of live in low density fashion. And I want to show you an example of, or a couple examples of the PLSS system. One is going to be in Ohio, and I'll show you the landscape pattern of that. So here's an example of the PLSS system implemented in Ohio. Again, a couple hundred years of land division in Ohio, very rural, very farm-based, very square. You find the dark patches you see are isolated forest patches. If you zoom in, parcels will show up here, and you see very square parcels following the public land survey system, roads every mile, and parcel boundaries that don't necessarily conform to the landscape, the drainage system, the drainage pattern. So when trying to implement, runoff management plans or stormwater or something like that, it becomes very challenging when you've got many different landowners with arbitrary parcel lines that don't really conform to the natural landscape. The other example I wanted to show you is out west as another implication of the public land survey system was the railroad land grants. And I'm not going to go into the history of the railroad land grants, but essentially the United States government, every other mile section was given away to the railroad companies, which in turn was then sold to a lot of the private or the industrial forest companies. And then the federal government maintained ownership of all of the other diagonal parcels as well. And so what you see here is a checkerboard pattern of forest management. The dark areas being mature forests that aren't necessarily logged. Those are government-held properties. And the lighter shades here, like in the center, are actively harvested areas by the private forest companies, and they're mostly clear-cut. And so from space or from out, they have a distinct checkerboard pattern. Now this is evident all over the western United States. And what's interesting is when you get an oblique view of this, and again, one of the implications with the public land survey system was that they don't conform to natural features or boundaries or topography, and so you find that it's very fragmenting. And that's what some of the conservationists across the country have argued, is that this system has increased fragmentation due to the squaring of fields and forests along arbitrary boundary lines. I mean, others argue that it's less appealing and it's too controlled of a look, like what we saw in Ohio. So that's some history on land division techniques. Not all rural areas are growing, though. This is a picture of some rural areas in Wisconsin during the Great Depression. Areas that don't have abundant amenities and natural features, aren't experiencing parcelization or growth. In fact, during the Great Depression era, a lot of rural communities lost population. This is a plat book that you see in Douglas County, northwest Wisconsin in the 1930s or 40s, I believe. And you can see it's all parcelized, all privately owned. And after about 10 years or shortly after, during the Great Depression, you saw reverse parcelization. In fact, many people just abandoned their lands and they left. And they couldn't make a living off of some of this land, and so they left. And you saw reverse parcelization. The green shaded here, you see, has reverted back to public ownership, and the county now maintains that. And so you saw what was once a parcelized landscape, privately owned. Now half of it is actually one landowner, the county, with much larger parcels. There are many response strategies to parcelization. Wisconsin was one of the first states to implement rural zoning and encourage rural zoning. Part of that was due to what you saw in the previous slide and people living in far-flung rural Wisconsin. It was very expensive to maintain roads for a landowner on the end of a dead-end road to bus some of these kids way out in the middle of nowhere. And so zoning has been implemented to address some of these as well. Also, subdivision ordinances are one of the, probably lesser used strategies or tools for implementing parcelization. However, you find that with the example, the picture you see there, there are a lot of people that try to, the subdivision ordinances oftentimes tend to be weak, especially in rural areas. And people will oftentimes try to dodge the subdivision review ordinance. This example you see appears to be a subdivision. It has a road and a cul-de-sac and many lots. However, this subdivision did not go through a public review process or a subdivision review process because the subdivision ordinance was rather weak, stating that I think in order to be reviewed it had to have 5 parcels, 1.5 acres or less. Well, the landowner here decided to put a road in and create parcels that were larger than the required minimum, therefore not triggering a review process. And at the time when they sold the lots and it was developed, the road was a private road. However, the first big snowfall, people in the town board or the town road crew was getting called to have the road plowed, and the town said, well, this isn't that's not our road, we don't maintain it. Eventually the town ended up taking it over, but it shows some of the challenges of landowners playing developer and taking it into their own hands, as you find that a lot of the roads and parcels aren't up to code. There aren't enough stormwater management techniques in the subdivision. But as subdivision ordinances, you're finding to be a little more innovative here recently to address some of those concerns. Other strategies you're seeing, purchase of development rights programs, transfer of development rights, and also one of the bigger things, because of parcelization and the loss and development of sensitive lands, is you saw, I think it was in about the 1970s, you saw really the growth of land trusts and conservation easements, purchasing land to limit parcelization on some of these properties. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some previous research on parcelization. Parcelization research does not go back very far. Most of the research has been rather new, and they focus on the drivers of parcelization through surveys, dealing with stakeholders. And then the other research that you find is people who are trying to measure parcelization and trying to get a handle on, how do we quantify parcelization. And how they've done that is essentially they've counted the number of landowners or the number of parcels in an area and documented that over time, or they documented the change in average parcel size. So most of the analysis in parcelization has been non-spatial in nature. And as I alluded to before, is parcelization does lead, or hypothesized lead to fragmentation. So pattern of parcelization does matter. And that's kind of what I want to show here and talk about here. Is the conventional way to measure parcelization was to use average parcel size or the number of parcels. And there's several studies out there that try to show that, yeah, the number of parcels are increasing. And if you look at this example here, this hypothetical landscape, is both of these have the same number of parcels and the same average parcel size. And so one would, without looking at the pattern, would assume that they're the same, but they're not. In fact, the pattern is very different. And so what we tried to do here with the Center for Land Use Education is try to use a more spatially sophisticated approach on analyzing parcelization. Can we quantify the pattern? Because pattern does matter. We have the tools available to do that now, such as GIS and landscape ecology. And so one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of studies, at least historical studies on parcelization, is because there's really inadequate data. Most of the data is paper records, published plat books that go back a long ways, but they're in a paper format. Sometimes they don't even exist. And there's inconsistent data, especially if you're looking at between different municipalities or different counties. The way they record them is different. And that proves as a challenge. So now I want to talk about how the Center for Land Use used GIS to study and analyze parcelization. We received a grant a few years ago to address this and study parcelization, and our goal was to take those paper records and come up with an historic paper or digital record spatial database of parcel patterns. So we recreated historic land parcelization patterns over time in two different communities in Wisconsin. One was in the northern forested region to understand some of the forest patterns going on, and the other was in the southern portion looking at farmland parcelization. And what we really wanted to do, our objectives were to see if we can apply spatial metrics other than number and average size to really express the spatial pattern of parcelization. And our other goal was to see if we can predict parcelization using some of the factors or landscape factors that influence it. Looking at a current parcel layer, there's definitely a pattern there. And if you overlay that on top of slopes and water and wetlands and roads, there appears to be things that are influencing where parcels are being created. So we wanted to see if we can come up with an historic temporal database in terms of parcels and land cover and these other variables and see if we can't model parcelization. And then the third thing we wanted to do is to see, what is the link between parcelization, land use change, and fragmentation. There's a hypothesized link that, yeah, parcelization does lead to fragmentation, but we wanted to get at sort of, does it really, or is there, what is that time lag between when a parcel is created and when land use or fragmentation occurs? So one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of parcelization research, especially going back that far, is that, again, it's in paper format. And so it took us nearly 2 years to recreate parcel data layers for 6 towns in 2 counties. What we did is we researched archival tax assessment records. We basically started with the current digital tax parcel layer and worked backwards. We merged parcels into their parents, so to speak, based on a PIN number that was recorded in the tax rolls. And we used supplementary data, plat books, and local knowledge as well. In addition to creating historical parcel layers, we also collected and orthorectified, archived historical aerial photos as well. So we were able to generate historical land cover, land use data layers that mirrored some of the dates that we had parcel data for. And so we're able to generate, these historical land cover data layers as well to try to tease out some of these trends and variables. So here's 2 graphs that show for 3 of the towns in our southern county, our farmland county, using traditional metrics. The number of parcels created over time from 1953 to 2005, and then the average parcel size. Now this is what a lot of other researchers have done to quantify trends in parcelization. And by just looking at this graph, the blue line on the left is the town of Lodi had the most parcel creation during that time period. Springvale having the least, and the town of West Point in red having about the middle. And you would expect on the right, the average parcel size would reflect the number of new parcels. And so looking at these 2 graphs, one would say, well, Lodi and West Point had the most parcelization, and the town of Springville had the least. However, if we put on our spatial glasses here and try to look at this landscape in a different lens, trying to apply landscape ecology metrics, we might find that it's not so much the number and quantity and size of parcels as it is the patterns. And so that was our approach to this. And just a little primer on landscape ecology is landscape ecology, with that you utilize maps, remote sensing data, and species information to improve the understanding of species in ecological landscapes. Essentially what they're trying to do is you're trying to quantify and measure a landscape spatially. What is the pattern of it? The field has grown tremendously the last 20 years, and you're finally starting to see it infiltrate into the planning realm, especially with mapping corridors and core area and kind of connecting some of these greenways and whatnot. What we did with our first objective was to apply a landscape ecology metric that seemed to make sense and that people could understand. The one we chose was the nearest neighbor metric. The nearest neighbor metric essentially creates or calculates an index based on the average distance between new features and its nearest feature. And so with our temporal parcel data, we essentially extracted at each time period the new parcels and calculated a nearest neighbor index on that. And what you're trying to do is trying to assess, is this pattern more dispersed or clustered over time? Are parcel patterns more clustered or dispersed, similar to the graphic there below? And so if we apply that to our parcel layers over time, we see that sort of the reverse trend here happen, where Lodi had the most parcels, but the nearest neighbor index shows that most of the parcels were very clustered and close together. The town of Springvale had very few parcels, and they were all really scattered about. They didn't have much parcelization growth, but all their parcels were very dispersed. A dispersed pattern is really considered a more fragmented pattern because it perforates the surrounding open landscape, and then West Point in the middle there. And like I said, we also mapped historic land cover and land use data over time. So now we're able to measure the pattern of parcelization and then analyze the resulting landscape with landscape ecology metrics on did the landscape also reflect what we saw in terms of the spatial pattern of parcels. And so this is showing the farmland landscape. So we extracted the land, the farmland cover from the land use and measured its pattern. And so we found that in Lodi, even though Lodi had the most number of new parcels created over time, they had over 2,000 parcels created or generated during that time, you saw that the number of farmland patches increased, but not as much as what we saw in the town of West Point. And similarly with the core area, we found the core area in West Point decreased more than you saw in Lodi, albeit not as much, but still it decreased more. And the largest patch index, which is a measure of the largest patch size of a landscape, we saw that decrease mostly with West Point. And so just looking at the aspatial metrics, the number of parcels and the average parcel size, one would conclude that Lodi experienced the most parcelization, when in fact, because of its pattern, did not. And I think what I'll do with that is go show you an example of our historic parcel layers for West Point. So this is a web map that I generated that highlights where our case study communities are. The red outlines show the town boundaries. I'm going to zoom down to the town of Lodi and West Point. And what you're going to see pop up here is the roughly 1950 parcel pattern in these two towns. And you can see that, again, this took us about a year to generate these parcel lines. If we fast forward or play this, you will see that parcels are popping up over time. And there is a pattern there. And I guess what the main point of this is trying to measure spatially the pattern of parcelization, is that the town of Lodi on the right here had the most parcels. But you can see most of the parcels are embedded in this one subdivision that is up on the top northern part of the town. If you scroll over to West Point, which did not have as much parcelization in terms of number of parcels, the parcels, according to the nearest neighbor index, were much more dispersed. They were not as clustered. And as a result of that, we're finding that the farmland in that town is becoming more fragmented. You'll notice little pockets of larger parcels subdivided, scattered throughout the town than you do in the town of Lodi. And so the take-home message with that is that pattern does matter, and so if we can apply some of these spatial tools to how we analyze and assess parcelization, it could really help how the resulting landscape might be. And like I said, and like we saw with the French lot system in Louisiana, and how some of these, how we decide to parcelize our landscape now have dramatic effects and implications many decades from now. And if we know parcelization leads to fragmentation, we should be a little more aware and careful on how we pattern the parcelization. And the other thing I want to show with this web tool, I guess, is there's a concern that parcelization today is higher, the rate of parcelization is higher than it's ever been in the past. By conducting this historical and creating this historical parcel database, we found that the actual number of parcels in many of these have actually decreased. We found that during the 1960s, the number of parcels have actually decreased.
questions. They were tons and tons of questions. Yeah. Okay. Okay. We've got lots and lots of questions coming in, and I think we want to take a quick pause. Dan, if you've got a couple of parting shots, then let's go ahead and
sure.
grab some questions.
Sure.
All right. We have a number of people have asked if there's been any sort of study or how might this be applied to an urban area, or if
Well,
it can be.
I mean, I think it can be. Parcelization, you expect parcelization to develop in urban areas and around urban areas. I guess my focus in my research, I'm more familiar with rural areas, is the interesting part is we're finding a lot of rural areas that don't have much population growth or even negative population growth, but they're still parcelizing. And so, you know, as far as an urban focus, you can still look at the periphery, I guess, of an urban boundary and try to do some studies there. I guess we're finding that, you know, density does matter. So if we're concerned about parcelization and development in rural areas, I guess the key here would be to, you know, try to increase density nearer in cities and urban areas or along the periphery or even, you know, infill development.
Couple questions here in regard to how this happens, whether it is from zoning or the lack of zoning, or you know, what tends to be in place from a regulation standpoint that would allow this to happen. Have you discovered anything in your study?
A lot of in this study, a lot of the parcelization events took place prior to zoning or subdivision regulations. However, we do find a lot of, you know, parcelization in areas. You know, for example, a lot of forested areas have a forestry district, at least in Wisconsin. That's where I'm mostly familiar with, is a forestry district of a 5-acre minimum lot size. And so you find a lot of landowners that create these piano key lots, and I can bring that up. I can show examples of that. Piano key lots along roads that are exactly 5 acres. And so having a zoning ordinance that, you know, allows that is, especially in areas where you want to protect, is challenging. And the other thing is the subdivision ordinance tends to be weak a lot of times. We're finding that a lot of towns and communities now are actually trying to implement or actually are implementing a subdivision ordinance where every single lot split gets reviewed rather than, you know, some sort of arbitrary number or size triggering a review process. I could sit here all day and zoom around and show crazy parcel patterns throughout not only Wisconsin but the country. Landowners and developers are creative. They will try to fit as many parcels as they can on a property given the regulatory constraints, minimum lot sizes, setbacks. If they can fit them on there, they'll do that. Let's see if I can find that.
Okay, while you're looking, perhaps you could, this is just a very specific question. Someone wanted to know, you made the remark about the highest parcelization occurring in the 1960s. Did that data come from across the U.S. or was that for a specific area?
Well, we're finding that most of the large pre-platted subdivisions, like I showed in Albuquerque and Florida, most of that happened in the South and West. Some of the numbers that we found in Wisconsin, going back, recreating our data in Bayfield County and Columbia County, is most of the parcels were created during the 1960s. There were large subdivisions that were platted, and here, I'll even, so this example here shows piano key lots in northern Wisconsin. I think these are 10-acre lots, or these are 5-acre lots, I think. So a 5-acre minimum lot size does, I'm sorry, nothing for protecting forest land. Going back to your question about the rates of parcelization, in Bayfield County, we found that most of the parcelization was in during the 50s and 60s. Now, I think a lot of that had to do with shoreline zoning. A lot of developers and landowners knew that shoreline zoning rules were going to be in place and allowing and restricting the amount of rampant sales along our shorelines. This subdivision here, for example, is an example. What you'll see here in Bayfield County in the 1950s, it looked like this. Shortly after that, a subdivision like this went in, right before shoreline zoning. And the same thing happened along the Wisconsin River in southern Wisconsin, is developers took advantage of knowing that these rules were going to be in place. And so I think during the 1960s, you saw the subdivision, the interstate land sale, or interstate subdivision law, shoreline zoning, sort of this environmental movement. And so I think a lot of developers and landowners took advantage of that to rush to create as many lots as they can before these ordinances got in place.
Okay. Are you aware of any jurisdiction that has tried to reverse this parcelization?
Mm-hmm. The subdivision I showed in Florida, for example, half of that I think has been purchased by the state and is now a state property. Other municipalities have tried to do that. It's complex. They essentially, a lot of times what they will do is, if they are non-conforming lots, if the subdivision or the parcels were created before an ordinance went in and are not now conforming, they'll require that a landowner conglomerate or merge several parcels together before they can build upon it. That's happening. I mean, you find these subdivisions all over the country. A lot of them are smaller, but there are tools, I think, in place for folks. But the problem is, I think, is planners are pulling their hair out because these folks have held on to this property for such a long time, or it's been passed down generations, and the great-great-grandchild of it, comes in with a building permit and a variance, and what do you do? They're challenging.
Right. Okay, another question talking about availability of data. Asked if you'd looked at the growth in square foot of average size house. The example given, an old house is demolished, a larger house built with very little green space. Is there any type of data available to show, I guess, the change in imperviousness in a particular lot? Has that increased?
Well, there are studies, I think, in terms of the Wisconsin shoreline zoning law that, they've analyzed this, but I mean, anecdotally, older homes were much smaller, and we're finding that a lot of our riparian properties that are some of the older properties have a much smaller building footprint, less impervious surface, and we're finding that some of these newer parcels are having much more impervious surface. The building footprint is being much larger. People are building bigger homes, and in fact, a lot of counties and grant variances to expand their older cabins to make them more livable on some of these properties.
Okay, is any data available if someone were to want to do an assessment?
Usually, if you can get tax assessment data from the assessor, a lot of times they will have building footprint data, square footages. Sometimes it's complex to analyze. It's stored in a complex database, but pulling that out usually can be attached back to the parcel. One of the things that we're trying to get communities and counties to do in Wisconsin is, this, parcelization is really, we're sort of at the cusp of it spatially, partly because only recently have parcels been in a digital format. And since they have been, a lot of counties every year when they update their parcel database is they overwrite the previous year in terms of the tax assessment data and also the property boundaries. And so we're trying to get counties to archive this, to say, okay, this is your, time 1, time 2, and every year. So 15 years from now, you'll have 15 years of tax parcel boundaries and tax assessment data, allowing us to not spend a year digitizing and recreating parcels, but instead having a much wider scale and more data in terms of economic data, land use data, housing, square footage data, to do much more spatial modeling and statistics.
Okay, and then another quick question just about the technology is, someone asked how you can add parcels to Google Earth.
It's really not that hard. If you have ArcGIS, I think 9.3 or later, in our toolbox you will find a tool, I can't remember which one. It's under conversion. You can convert your shapefiles or your feature classes to a KML file, and KML files can be brought into Google Earth. The version I have here, this is Google Earth Pro. So while I was zooming out to some of these areas, you saw white parcel lines pop up. That's an amenity with Google Earth Pro. It doesn't come with the free version of Google Earth. But all GIS data can be accessed or exported to Google Earth. And I like it because Google Earth is much faster, and it gives you the 3D rendering, which is very powerful. So if you're not doing any sophisticated spatial statistics or landscape ecology metrics, just a visual of it is very important, and we find that a lot of the citizens find that very powerful as well.
Okay, when you looked at your study, did you look at anything in regards to property tax exemptions as sort of a management tool, or any sort of assessment of how property taxes or how that was tweaked? Did that change?
We didn't, partly because our historic nature, a lot of that data was too dynamic or too difficult to track. And so again, going forward, we're hoping that counties and communities keep records of that, digital copies of that. Now with technology today and ArcSDE and the storage limits on our servers, archiving this data should not be a problem. In fact, we've got numerous counties now on board that are doing that. But we did not specifically look at that just because of the amount of time and effort that was taken just to create accurate parcel lines.
Okay, and then kind of a parallel question having to do with, did you track anything with zoning changes or try to make a relationship between a certain type of zoning and the resulting parcelization?
We did not, because we found in our 2 counties the zoning was very dynamic and it changed almost at will, it seemed like. And so trying to relate that or the relationship between zoning and parcelization, we couldn't do that because it was too dynamic. Again, we're hoping that with comprehensive planning and updated zoning ordinances going forward, we will be able to do that.
All right. I guess, Cody, it's back to you.
Yes, thank you.
He's still there?
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay.
You're in a tunnel.
Okay, 1 second.
No, that's fine.
Okay, just some closing remarks on how to log SAM credits and going through that. So for those of you still in attendance, I just want to say to log SAM credits, you'll just need to go to www.planning.org/SAM, select activities by day, and then underneath Friday, May 6th, you'll see using GIS to improve planning decisions. And this is up, so you'll be able to go and log this as soon as you log out of here. And then we are also recording today's session, so you'll be able to find a PDF and video recording of today's webinar at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. And this should be up by Monday. So again, I just want to thank Dan and Linda for today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.